And our last presenter is Peter Hartley, who is chairman of the Rice Economics Department and anchoring our big study on global LNG. And he's going to talk a little bit about LNG and gas prices in Asia.
Okay, thank you very much. Actually, I'm going to, I think as Amy mentioned right at the start, I'm going to talk a little bit about the framework that we're intending to use to answer the question of what we think the Russian gas supply, the impact it will have on Asian markets. And indeed, part of the point here is for us to get some feedback on the approach we're intending to take at a fairly early stage. So I'm going to emphasise what we think are some of the key issues, but we're going to be listening very carefully to any suggestions from the floor about how we may want to take account of some other issues that we haven't been emphasising in our thinking to date, or maybe some things that we think might be interesting that all of you out there think that we're sort of blowing up some issue much more than we ought to. So it's very much sort of trying to set the scene of how we're going to think about the problem and put it in the context of some of our wider modelling efforts and to get some feedback. To make the point to begin with, again, Ken, who's sitting up the back, is very much involved in this study, and Jill, who's also mentioned there, is one of our graduate students. We have a couple of graduate students who are working on aspects of this project. So let me give you an overview of what I'm going to talk about. So one of the big points that I'm going to make, or that we think is a really important issue, is that we need to think about the effects of Russian gas supply in Asia. We have to think about that in the context of the world gas market. And this particular study is part of this larger ongoing effort in the Baker Institute to build a world gas market model, and we're going to use that model to examine a number of issues, and this effect of Russian gas supply on Asia is just one of the issues. So this is sort of part of a bigger project. And in the subsequent slides, I'm going to focus a bit on some of the way we're thinking about building this world gas model, what we think are some of the key issues, and then so some discussion of the demand side of our model, then the supply side, and then another interesting question that we have been studying in the Baker Institute is potential changes in market structure in the world gas market, and I want to talk a little bit about that and how we're going to build that into our model. And then have a few remarks about what we think at the moment, and again I emphasise as preliminary sort of thinking of the issue, what we think are some of the key issues that are going to drive this our analysis of this likely impact of Russian gas on Asia. And then to keep you all awake, I've got one last thing I want to talk about is this radical possibility, and we'll come back and tell you what that idea is all about. But just to keep you awake, I'm not going to tell you. I'm going to leave you in suspense. Okay, so first thing is talk a little bit about the gas model. And this is a picture that Jill put together, Jill Nesbitt, her graduate students put together using USGS data. And there's a nice picture there from the satellites. And the lights, of course, show you where something to do with energy demand. That's all the cities around the world mainly. So, of course, electricity demand is really what's emphasised there. But still, this can be highly correlated with transport energy demand as well. But anyway, the lights show you where the energy demand is. And then the coloured patches show you where the gas is available, or where we think the gas is available. And the lighter purple colour is sort of less, and then darker purple's more, and so on, and red hot is where we think there's some more gas. So obviously the two red hot spots are of course, Russia and the Middle East. And the issue, of course, is in terms, that picture really emphasises is that where the gas is located sort of ain't where the lights are on. So you got to get the gas from where it's located to where the lights are on. And that's a key part of the model. So where the gas is the supply point, where the lights are on is the demand. And the model that we're going or the model that we're in the process of building is a spatial general equilibrium model, where in each time period we're going to look at the sources of supply. We do look at the sources of supply, and we look at the sources, the sinks of demand, I guess you'd say. Sources of supply and the sinks of demand. And we have transport links between the sources of supply and the sinks of demand. Of course, you can't in practice, these things are spread out over lots and lots of areas, so what we have to do to have a manageable model is shrink down the sources of supply and demand into these, what I call here, discrete nodes. So we lump together demand in different regions and have transport links between them. Now, the other important point about the model is that it's not just a model that looks at equating supply and demand within a period. There are, of course, also links between periods. And in particular, the idea is that producers will take account of expected future prices. An alternative to extracting a resource and selling it today is you leave it in the ground and sell it in the future. And, of course, whether you want to leave it in the ground or sell it today depends on what the price is today relative to what you expect it will be in the future. So there's also a link between periods here that's driven by expectations about future prices. And we also, at these different nodes of demand and supply, we don't just have fixed supplies or fixed demands. There's some economics and geological fundamentals are modelled at each of these supply and demand nodes. And in particular, we're going to take account of some of the economic factors influence demand and some of the geological factors influence supply. A key point of the model as well, and this is emphasised, I guess, follows up from the presentation you just heard, is that these links between nodes don't just transport physical commodities in one direction, they also, in a sense, transport prices back in the other. So the prices between different regions are also linked by the transport costs. And put that another way, as Ron was just emphasising, price differentials also are limited by the transport costs of arbitraging between different demand nodes. So the model gives us prices, it gives us capacity and reserve additions, and tells us how gas flows, and put all that together in a multiple period framework. And then the issue we want to talk about is what's going to happen to when we have the Russian supply entering into the picture. And in particular, what's going to happen in Asia when that Russian gas supply enters the picture. Now here is some data on natural gas consumption by region in 2001 and also as forecast in 2025. This is not our forecast. As I said, our forecast can be based on our own modelling effort, but this just to give you an idea. Some of those numbers may be a little bit hard to read, I'm afraid, but the top number is, of course, 2001, second number 2025. And one key thing here is, of course, we've got big increase here in the Asian area because of the growth of China and India in demand. And of course, quite a big increase in the former Soviet Union. Less in percentage terms in the more mature markets. And, you know, again, Ron and Ken have a model talking about how the paper that Amy mentioned, that talks about how economic development affects the growth and demand for energy. So that's, it's part of the story here with these Asian economies developing, sort of leading to rapid increases in energy demand. What we will do specifically in the model, to model demand ourselves, is we're going to allow demand to be elastic with respect to price, as Ron was just emphasising, but also with respect to GMP. And we use econometric techniques to estimate the sensitivity of demand to those factors. They're two key factors. Our GMP forecast growth we're going to take from someone else. In principle, one could try to model the whole thing, but we're restricting ourselves to the energy market, and so an important input here is going to be forecast what do you think is going to happen to GNP growth, and I guess that relates to the very first talk this morning, actually, as well. When we're thinking about the calm waters and the rough seas, is, what do you think is going to happen to world output growth? And that's going to be an important factor on influence on demand. And in our case, we will take another forecast of GNP, but then we will do sensitivity analysis. But the dependence of energy demand on GNP is going to be based on this modelling framework I mentioned that Ron and Ken worked on. Factor about that is that this approach is sector specific. I say to a degree, because again, you could cut demand up into lots and lots of different parcels. There's a limit, again, of complexity, how complex you want to go. So you aggregate this into a few sectors and just talk about the demand in those sectors and then aggregate up. On the supply side, we're going to use, or we have already put into our model, US geological survey data. We can break down the supply potential into proved reserves, field or reserve growth in known fields, and then undiscovered resource, the way out stuff. And here's world natural gas reserves, proved reserves by region in 2003, and of course the two big numbers are former Soviet Union and the Middle East. 1964, 1979 respectively. And they dwarf all the other numbers there on the picture. And that's why Russian gas is going to be important. And this model, we're going to look at what's going to happen over the next 30 years. Obviously, these current reserves, Russia is a big player, but in sort of undiscovered gas in the existing field, that's sort of the second category. Former Soviet Union also is a very big player, 35%. Middle East and North Africa, number 2, and then all the other players, small parts of the pie chart. And in yet to find natural gas, again, former Soviet Union, 1436, Middle East, 1220. So this is going to suggest that Russia is going to play a very important role in this model, in this market. And another interesting fact is that a lot of this potential, if you look at the same data source, a lot of the potential is offshore. So blue here for the water is offshore, and the brown for the land. I'm thinking of dry land, I guess. It maybe should have been green, but anyway, there we go. Thinking of dirt. Brown dirt is onshore, and the blue water is offshore. A lot of potential, particularly in the former Soviet Union's offshore. And that will have implications as well for the way that these resources may be exploited, and in particular LNG versus pipeline, and that's going to be a critical factor in our model. Speaking about LNG versus pipelines, that's the next issue, is natural gas transportation. And the key factor of the model is to determine where pipelines versus LNG will be the most favoured transport option. And of course, LNG developments are going to be heavily affected by changes in technical costs, and that's going to be another key sensitivity issue in our model. So we want to change over this long forecast horizon, change the assumptions about technological improvements in pipelines versus LNG costs, and see how that alters the equilibrium for both where gas is shipped and prices. And key issue here is going to be the extent to which cost reductions pertain to fixed versus variable, because this may affect the market structure, something I'm going to talk about in a moment. And again, these cost reductions we're going to take as outside the model. We're not going to try to forecast technological change. Although I would say that I do believe that likely price movements in the market would influence technical change. Is not just technical change as the driver exogenously. In reality, if you think prices are going to go up, you might spend a lot. It's a lot more worthwhile to do R&D in that sort of area to lower costs and so on. So, really, technical developments do have an endogenous component too. But again, just like the GNP growth probably has an endogenous component, changes in energy prices will affect growth as well as growth affecting energy prices. But you've got to stop somewhere. So our intention was to to take those as exogenous like the growth forecasts. Now, another issue we think will be key over this next several decades will be what's going to happen in the world market for LNG. And in particular, we believe that more LNG may be sold on a worldwide spot commodity market than has been the case up till now, where there are fewer long-term bilateral contracts, less project-specific finance, more multilateral trades, and perhaps unfashionably in the wake of Enron and energy trading becoming a dirty word and so forth, we nevertheless think that in the longer term these derivative markets were very useful for people for hedging risks, and the utility of those markets will again come to the fore, and these things will be used as a way of hedging risks rather than longer term contracts. So I think that that will come back. So the focus of this approach of trying to understand what's going to happen to the market structure is we want to focus on the costs and benefits of long-term contracting. Long-term contracts help hedge the risks of larger liquid investments, but these contracts are less flexible in allowing firms to exploit new opportunities. And the thicker spot markets and the traded financial derivatives provide an alternative way to hedge risks. So we're going to include these elements in the model. A critical factor here is that the optimal behaviour of any one party depends on the expectations of what others are going to do. So there's an endogenous element to the market structure. And that's why we believe these market structures can flip from reliance on a lot of long-term contracts to reliance on a lot of spot contracts. Because if you're in a world where there's a lot of reliance on long-term bilateral contracts, that's the optimal thing for you to do as an individual buyer or seller. But if you think that there's going to be a much thicker market out there, spot market, then it's a lot less risky to leave more of your capacity uncontracted up on either the supply or the demand side. So your expectations about what everyone else is going to do affect what you think is your own behaviour, so the market can flip from one structure to the other. And but that will only happen, even though that market structure may be a sort of endogenous factor. There are also factors outside the market or outside those expectations about what other parties are going to do that influence the best way to sell your gas if you're a seller or buy the gas if you're a buyer. And a critical one is LNG shipping costs. So there's been a big fall in LNG shipping costs recently. And what that does, of course, is it increases the potential number of trading partners for any one buyer and the potential number of trading partners for any one seller. And that increase in the number of potential trading partners means that it's much less risky to leave yourself uncovered on either supply side or the demand side, and encourages people to rely much more on spot trades. That's kind of the idea. It's not the fall in shipping costs is not the only factor though. There's also been a reduction in some of the fixed costs. Fall in liquefaction plant costs, also regasification technologies have fallen in cost. And on the demand side, combined cycle gas turbines have reduced scale economies in electricity generation, which means that on the demand side, people also are not contracting up for as larger amount of supply as they used to in the past. So all of these reductions in fixed costs mean that you have less of an investment at stake and make it easier to rely on spot trades, make it less important to fix up long-term contracts. And another factor is that these lower upfront costs reduce the need, because they reduce the need for these very long-term contracts. That in itself will drive sort of shorter-term contracts. Lower upfront costs reduce the need for the long-term contracts for financing. And then the other thing, another important factor we believe is driving you towards having shorter contracts is higher rates of technical change and, of course, political change in energy markets, in particular electricity markets. So it's giving you more risks in those markets, which also encourages you to have shorter-term contracts, because you don't know what your demand's likely to be with this greater confidence. And the other thing is that another important factor that's going on, of course, is that the increase in use of gas and electricity generation with these progress in combined cycle technologies has greatly increased the number of potential trading partners for any supplier. And as I showed you with that picture of where the gas is, we've got these new potential suppliers as well entering the market. So having a greater number of players in the market also reduces the costs of relying on the spot market. You have a much thicker market, much less risky. So it's another factor that pushes you towards more spot trading. That doesn't mean that this world's going to come about. There are also potential problems. As I emphasised, the incentive for any one firm, the incentive for what they want to do depends on what other firms are doing. If others do not change, attempting to rely on trades, spot trades, becomes risky. On the other hand, the US market and the European market may help the transition. In particular, and this is something that's going to be emphasised in our model, in the US market you put in LNG import facilities that connects you into this big pipeline network with a very well-developed gas market, with well-developed derivative markets, and there's a similar thing in Europe, where you have competition between pipeline and LNG. So the fact that you can sell if you've got some excess gas that you don't have a buyer for, the fact that you can sell it into a big, thick market already by putting it into the pipeline network reduces a lot of the risks. The US market facilitates arbitrage between what Ron was talking about, the Pacific and the Atlantic basins. He's talking about oil, but same thing with gas. So how are we going to do that in our model? We're going to include the possibility for firms, suppliers and demanders to supply long-term contracts. Those contracts will sort of artificially distort the cost of shipping, so that you will tend to ship the amount that's contracted. There will be costs associated with arranging alternative trades if they're profitable. And if you're developing a new project, there'll be an advantage for contracting up in advance, getting the project off the ground, but there's going to be reduced flexibility down the track. Other important issues that we think are going to be very important in this model, we're going to talk about, for shorthand, we've got quote a gas OPEC, but really that's a shorthand. What we really mean is the sorts of factors that Ron was emphasising in terms of price discrimination, we're going to build into the model, basically using a very similar framework to what he's talking about. So it'll be exactly the same profit maximisation condition for the gas suppliers supplying to different markets as he talked about with the oil market. We've got ways of incorporating that into this general sort of equilibrium model that we're going to develop. But the profit maximising producer basically solves the same kind of problem that he talked about for the oil suppliers. And also we can use the model to talk about major political disruptions or political factors. For example, the Iraqi question or other things in the Middle East, the former Soviet Union. What do we think are the key issues that we want to talk about or analyse from the point of view of Russian supply to Asia? I've got here three things that we think are very important. First one is what's going to happen in Russia itself, Russian economic growth. The last couple of years we've had some pretty good figures out for growth in the Russian economy. The question is what's going to happen down the track. And that'll have a big impact on Russian demand. If we go back to the demand picture I had, the Russian domestic demand was also very important for gas. And another factor is what happens domestically to energy policy. So if you deregulate the electricity industry in Russia, it's going to lead people to put in combined cycle gas turbines like everywhere else, but perhaps even more so in Russia if gas prices remain controlled. And if you have controlled gas price but a deregulated electricity market, you could have a huge increase in domestic demand for gas, which would limit, of course, the amount that Russia has available for export. The other key issue from the point of view of Russian supply to Asia is that Russian gas can also go west. And so critical factors there are what's going to happen to demand growth in Western Europe and actually excess demand growth in Western Europe. Demand growth in Western Europe minus supply from alternative sources, North Sea, North Africa, and then of course LNG like I mentioned. And if you start thinking about Russian gas either going east or west, one factor is pipelines. You can put the pipeline going west or you can put a pipeline going east. But another factor, as I mentioned, is LNG. And a lot of these Russian suppliers are offshore, potential supply. And a question is whether you might also get into LNG export market. And once you've got an LNG terminal, of course, it's easy to ship it either direction. So the issue is going to be, will Europe be a big competitor for the Middle East? And if another issue would be if Russia does ship more gas west, one factor that would mean, of course, is that Europe, then if they're buying from Russia, they don't have to buy as much from the Middle East. So there's an equilibrium effect you've got to take account of. So it's not just whether Russia can ship it either east or west. That has other implications for who'll be buying it from other sources. And then the other question is, of course, China. Where is it going to be supplied? Okay, here's my little, I mentioned one thing I was going to leave to last, which was something that is interesting, is a radical possibility for using Russian gas in the Asian context is, instead of shipping gas, how about you ship electricity? So another thing that's of interest is, we want to look at, is this question of whether you could use Sakhalin gas in particular to supply electricity in Japan through high voltage direct current transmission. So you ship the electricity instead of shipping the gas. And if you think about electricity transmission line versus a gas pipeline, it turns out that high voltage direct current is probably less costly if you're shipping, once you get to be shipping 2,000 megawatts over 1,000 kilometres. And actually high land prices favour the electricity option over the gas option. Another thing that would favour shipping the gas as electricity is that Sakhalin has more than, they have more resources than gas. They also have some coal. And shipping electricity would enable you to exploit the coal. And of course, the other thing you could do is if you had an electricity line that far up into Russia, you could also go back into Siberia. And the big, very enticing factor about that is that Siberia has enormous unexploited hydroelectric reserves. That's somewhere between 450, 600 billion kilowatts of hydroelectricity, which is actually half of Japanese electricity output in 2001, just from the hydroelectricity alone. So if you were shipping electricity instead of the gas, you could actually also ship hydroelectricity. And that would make an enormous difference to Japanese energy market. It would be about a 3,000 kilometre, 3,000 kilometre line, 11,000 megawatts, would enable electricity to be exported from Siberia to Japan. And you might think that's a big project, but actually similar projects of a similar scale have been proposed for Canada, China, Zaire, shipping electricity to Europe, and Brazil. There are other benefits of such a link. If you terminated the electricity line at the boundary between the 50 hertz and the 60 hertz electricity systems in Japan, you could have a terrific increase in competition in the electricity industry in Japan. Currently only 900 megawatts shipped between 50 and 60 hertz regions in Japan, versus a TEPCO, for example, Tokyo Electric Power Company generating capacity of 78,834 megawatts. A trivial interchange between the two regions. If you had 11,000 megawatts coming in, all of a sudden you have a lot more competition in the Japanese electricity market. There are also engineering advantages, increased stability of the Japanese transmission network. Some of the proposed capacity being added to the Japanese system is nuclear plants. And another thing we're doing at the Baker Institute is another project actually is we're modelling the Japanese electrical transmission system. So it will enable us to look at these questions. Another benefit of shipping electricity rather than gas is that you put all the pollution up there in Siberia instead of having it down in Tokyo. And not very many people up in Siberia to worry about it. So what are some of the problems with the high voltage link? One way I put this before is if Russia were Canada and Japan were the United States, you of course would do this, and that's what's happening in North America. The hydroelectricity is being produced in Canada, And also people are talking about using gas in Canada to produce electricity and ship it down to the United States. But of course the political relationship between the United States and Canada is a little different, perhaps, than the one between Japan and Russia. So, number one problem. There are difficult climatic conditions. Siberian infrastructure is undeveloped. And it may also be some new technologies perhaps are needed. So this scheme, although it's perhaps on the margin of what's feasible. So for transfers of 5,000 megawatts over 4,000 kilometres, the optimum voltage to use in a high voltage circuit actually increases. To cope with that, maybe some technological developments would be needed. Lower line losses will reduce the optimum voltage. And indeed, some people here at Rice in our nanotechnology area are interested in this question and believe that there may be some possibility for some dramatic breakthroughs in high voltage transmission, which would make a project such as this technically feasible, very economic. Summary, final slide. Key points we believe Russian energy supply must be viewed in a global context. Russia's large on the supply side, Asia, including that Japan and China. Japan now, in the time horizon we're looking at, China will be large on the demand side. Second point, increasing LNG trade may alter the structure of the global gas market. And a critical point here is that very small flows are sufficient to arbitrage prices. The size of the flows affects the speed of the adjustment, but just the existence of the flows is enough to arbitrage prices. So once you've got a market where you're shipping LNG around the world, you can have much more arbitrage of gas prices. That, of course, is subject to transport costs, as Ron was emphasising with the oil market, same sort of thing applies. And gas markets, the developments in the gas market depend on other markets, electricity in particular is the other key point, which is emphasised by my final little speculative discussion. And another point that came out of that little exercise is that other energy sources can be complements as well as substitutes. So what I mean by that is, take for example the hydroelectricity in Siberia, that could actually complement the use of gas for electricity in Japan. Just because it's an alternative way of generating electricity doesn't necessarily mean it displaces gas. If you're going to put in the electricity transmission capacity to use the hydroelectricity, can actually facilitate also the exploitation of gas. Thank you.
Okay, I think we should try to have sort of a facilitated discussion where people don't actually stand back up that we're presenters, but we just kind of stay where we are. Does anybody want to open the floor with a question or a comment on pricing, either oil or gas? No question.
I'd like to ask Mr. Patrick. He has shown several options for utilizing natural gas. But there would be one more option to be considered. That may be GTL rather than LNG. You know, in the Asian market, the LNG is priced almost same with the crude oil price at this moment. But the market power is pressing the LNG price down. And in the process of LNG, say natural gas production and liquefaction and transportation, the total shrinkage is about 15% from oil field wellhead to the consumer side. And if natural gas LNG price goes down further, then the GTL may have another possibility, especially as a form to transport interior natural gas like located in East Siberia. I wonder if you have incorporated this possibility in your model.
Actually, that's a very good question. I mean, one thing we did was, one thing I forgot to mention, is that actually another aspect of our modelling exercise here is we're also looking at the relationship between gas prices and oil prices. So one of the factors there would be gas to liquids, but another factor would be on the electricity side, of course. So there's a lot of oil-fired electricity plant still in Japan, and so you can also switch fuels have fuel substitution on the electricity side, which will also influence the relationship between gas prices and oil prices.
Mm-hmm.
So indeed, there's another aspect of our study is to look at that relationship. So, and actually another thing I forgot to mention too is that the other thing we're interested in is actually the link between coal and gas. So another alternative is integrated gasification and combined cycle gas turbines. So there actually are already 2 power stations in the United States, one in Indiana and one in Florida. One of them is a converted old-style coal-fired power plant. The one in Florida is actually a greenfields project. Both of those, though, take coal and produce gas, gasify the coal, and then run the gas through a combined cycle turbine, produce electricity, and then of course the steam is also used again at the gasification end. And these 2 projects indicate that there could also be competition for gas, because this is very clean burning. It turns coal. It's a very small percentage of emissions compared with conventional coal. So, so another factor that it can influence the gas price is also competition for coal.
Yes, I read the possibility of the coal gasification for combined cycle type power generation. But another problem for high voltage power transmission for Japan is another NIMBY issue relating to the transmission lines. And right of way is a very big issue that the Sakhalin-1 project cannot find any way to Japan.
Yeah.
If right of way is easy, like in the United States, now the Tokyo Gas or Tokyo Electric already have been using the gas.
Yeah.
But I don't see any possibility this issue could be politically solved within a decade or 2 in Japan.
But if you already do have electric right-of-way, you may be able to put, I mean, the size of the right-of-way for a high voltage direct current, much less than for AC.
But it is construction cost of high voltage transmission line in Japan is extremely expensive.
Okay, so it's something we need to look at. I mean, with respect to the NIMBY on the line, I mean, in the United States, there's this proposal for using Canadian natural gas off the Atlantic coast. So, and to put in a high voltage line, and the idea there is actually undersea. So, newer technologies, it's actually competitive to have high voltage undersea cable.
Yes. Thank you very much. On your part, your suggestion is that we should look into the Japanese part to solve these issues, problems.
Maybe.
Let me ask, I have a question for you, Peter, because in Mr. Ogawa's presentation, he made the important point that the Asian premium has bearing not just on oil and the oil acquisition price for Japan, but that the LNG price is tied to Arab Light. Having worked now on your model, do you think as we move forward that Asia could go on to what we call here in America gas-on-gas pricing? And that would at least get the gas portion of Japan's energy cost more related away from the price of Arab Light.
I think that what we're going to find when we build the monopoly elements into our model, that very similar monopoly pricing issues are going to be there for gas as there are for oil. So, in fact, I mean, the higher transport costs between the markets. So, key point with Ron's discussion is that you've got these different elasticity conditions that give you the price ratio, optimal price ratio, but that's the ability to exploit that is limited by the transport costs. So if the transport costs are higher, there's a much wider band where you can exploit the monopoly power, right? So now, on the other hand, the issues we've just been discussing relating, there's also gas on oil competition and gas on coal and so forth. So that's going to be another limiting factor in the price differentials. But still, the transport costs alone would actually, you think, give you more monopoly pricing possibilities in gas than in oil.
Let me mention, talking about monopolies and gas, Ron and I had a very interesting experience. We went to this OPEC meeting in September, and we went with some officials there and talked about the plans for well, it's called the Gas Forum for exporting countries. And we were trying to imagine in our own modeling, where they're gonna have, would Qatar play swing producer, or might the Russians play swing producer? And the interesting thing was that we hadn't conceptualized what they were conceptualizing, because it's true that Algeria and some of the other countries are moving towards contracts that allow for arbitrage in markets. So the new Algerian contracts are going to allow BP or some of the other players to buy a certain volume of gas and have it not be destination restriction. So the gas contract is for use in the UK, but if they have an opportunity to make more money selling to the US or selling to Asia, then the contract works that Sonatrach, BP pays Sonatrach the half of the profit that's made from moving the cargo somewhere different, right? But the BP has the take or pay, not the end user in the UK. So it's kind of an interesting contract. So we're thinking like, how would the market develop if everybody had contracts like that? But their idea was totally different. Their idea was that every producer, the key producers, Iran, Russia, Algeria, Nigeria, would form a grouping, and they would have a agreement on which projects could move forward. So they would stage the LNG projects in the order whether they perceived that the market was going to be oversupplied or undersupplied. So in a perception that there was going to be a lot of gas available to go to Asia and demand was going to be slow, the producer group would decide that the 5th train for Sakhalin gas, or Sakhalin 3, they would choose Russia to delay it by 3 years. And they would stagger that with the new Algerian train, and what they would actually control is the ordering and timing of trains. And it was a very interesting discussion because whereas some of the other things that we had thought about in the gas market in terms of pulling spot supply off or pulling spot supply on looked to be very hard to do in the gas market, to have somebody be a dominant producer like Saudi Arabia is in the oil market. This ordering of LNG trains would have huge implications, not only for companies like Shell and Exxon, because your project timing would get completely determined not by the economics as seen by the private company, but by the economics as perceived by the host country. But that you could get this very tight control of the gas market if the sources of supply didn't come on in any kind of a natural or unstaggered basis.
Because that's a corollary.
Corollary, right.
Corollary of having a sort of what we call the gas open. Right? If you're going to have effective monopoly power, you've got to control the supply.
Right, but they're thinking...
Everyone has an incentive to, if you don't control supply, people would have an incentive to bring on the extra trains as soon as they're economic.
Correct.
So you've got to have some effective way of controlling that if you're going to be an effective monopoly.
Right.
So I guess in the oil market, Saudi Arabia...
Yeah, it does that with excess capacity, but
Yeah.
there's less coordination. In OPEC, they don't really coordinate when they bring on new oil fields.
Mm-hmm.
It's sort of been, one of the reasons they have market power now is there've just been these social, financial pressures left over from the 80s, so countries just haven't brought on new oil fields. Not because they were trying to control the price of oil, but just accidentally that it happened that way.
Part of the point is people cheat, but Saudi Arabia makes up for the cheating.
Right. So the interesting thing would be is could they control the pacing of trains?
Well, if they've got signed contracts, if they've got agreements with these companies, how would they finagle that? If you signed a contract saying, we want this train to be built.
Yeah, in 2007.
2007, and then you're saying all of a sudden 2010.
Right. That's why I'm saying if they were to actually pull it off, it would have a dramatic impact on the whole gas business.
That's a true.
It'd be very disruptive. Remember, OPEC was formed in '61 not to control the spot market for oil. OPEC was formed in '61 to renationalize oil reserves and get control back of them. So it's really sort of a going back to the original concept of OPEC. Now, whether they can pull it off or not, that's another story, but that is apparently what the intention is.
And do we have any idea what this forum, what countries are going to make up this forum? Is, for example, Qatar buying into this?
You know, that is, I think, something that we haven't gotten to the point of researching yet, but I mean, they see it that the main countries would be Russia, Qatar, if they would join Algeria, Nigeria, and Iran, right? We're like or would have to be the core. And I don't know if they have. I mean, let's just say that all the energy ministers of those countries are going to meet in Cairo in February, and they continue to have meetings, and so they now say that the meetings are just preliminary discussions of their views of the supply-demand balance, and they're going to actually commission a world LNG study and so forth to get in line to decide what it is that they would want to do. But it's sort of a staging. Like, the idea would be they get this LNG model, they decide where they think the world's going to go, and then they would start having negotiations about their individual projects and individual country needs versus the global need for having a stable gas market.
The quotas.
The quotas, right, yeah.
It would have an interesting political impact within OPEC itself, though.
It would, because
It
you're
would.
going to have these, well, and the interesting question about that, right, in the sort of, I don't have the slide, but in what I call the David Victor world, because we're doing this joint venture with Stanford, is you have this IPCC modeling forecast where, you know, you move to a world where oil stays at 20% of the energy market, you know, energy use market, but natural gas goes to 50% of the energy use market when you get out to 2050. So if you start to move towards that world, right, and the US economy starts to be more sensitive to changes in natural gas prices than oil prices, and the European market, you know, tends to become more sensitive to natural gas prices than oil prices and so forth, then the question becomes, you're right, do you have some kind of political shift inside OPEC? Because it's like, maybe cannibalism is sort of the right word. In other words, I'm selling more gas. I mean, we have a table on that, actually, that shows the chart where OPEC actually lost much more market share to the increase in natural gas use even from its own sources than to non-OPEC,
Yeah.
right? So if you consider that sort of the threat to the OPEC as the oil organization, which is this continued shift to natural gas, is eating into their market, right? Then it does raise some very interesting political questions.
Saudi and Iranian relationship.
Yeah, precisely. Right, and actually my perception is, but I haven't done a lot of research on this, but it might be a paper for you and I to do for this study, is it seemed to me like Algeria is really sort of like the brains of this idea, right? So the question is, you know, how does the politics develop inside this gas OPEC? And are the Russians really willing to play or not? Unlike the Russian position in oil, where I think that there's, you know, 25 Russian oil companies that are private, they're not likely to want to have Putin, they're trying to fight against, that's why Khodorkovsky's in jail, right? They're trying to fight against the Russian government from controlling their right to make commercial decisions. And they say that at our other seminar in Moscow in June, there was some discussion that TMK believed that if they could just pursue those things they wanted to pursue, that Russia could get back to 12.5 million barrels a day by 2012, right? If you then look back at Russia's structure in the gas business, I mean, Gazprom is not dismantled. And so whereas TNK and Yukos and Lukoil and all these companies in Russia are not interested in having Russia become a close associate of OPEC, right? Gazprom is a natural partner for a gas OPEC because it's a monopolist already in its thinking. So it's hard to know how Russia's going to feel, but it's kind of an interesting question. And then you get into this question of market share, same thing as we have in oil OPEC. I mean, the gas producer is going to be able to agree who gets what market share, because that's what I think is going to be the biggest barrier to doing this.
Yeah.
Is, you know, why should I cancel my train so that Algeria can take a piece of the European market, and I'm Russian, I'm going to wait, right? So I still think it's pretty hard to implement, but if they try, then the politics of it'll affect, you're right, the politics of the oil side.
So I would like to ask Dr. Soligo about Asian premium. Your analysis is very theoretical and suggestive. So according to your analysis, may I understand in this way, if Saudi and Russia come to an agreement to continue the price discrimination toward Asia, including Japan, or there is still, if so, there's no way to solve the discrimination on Asian premium.
Yes, because I don't think Russia is going to have a big impact on the premium, because most of the oil from Russia is going to go the west. Now it's true that as Sakhalin comes on and possibly the pipeline to China, that will bring more Russian oil into Asia. But by the time that occurs, the Asian demand will grow. So the Saudis will still have the very strong position they have now.
The marginal barrel will still be coming from them.
Right. And I want to make the distinction between what's going to happen to the average level of oil prices. If Russia starts exporting a lot of oil, possibly the price could drop. But it's not going to affect the differential. Unless, the things that could possibly, if we built pipelines down, I think Mr. Agawa mentioned the possibility of a pipeline from the Caspian down into the Gulf area. Anything that would increase the number of sources of oil in the, what I call that eastern sphere there, the Gulf Asian market, which would take a share away from the Saudis, would serve to diminish the power of the Saudis to maintain the differential.
So the point is, if you had a really huge supply glut in Europe, and that just pushed a tremendous amount of oil out to Asia, that would make more competition with Saudi. But you still have, and that's why I thought Professor Soligo's analogy about these two worlds that aren't connected and then they have this dollar connection, right? Because you still have the transportation cost, right? So that's why he's saying if the Caspian oil came down to the Persian Gulf, ironically, that might do more to dent the Asian premium than if the Caspian oil comes out Turkey, right? If it's a high enough volume. But the question is, how much volume do you have competing with the Saudi oil, right? Because the Russian oil, they're just going to be a price taker, right? So if they can, even though their transportation cost is going to be basically zero from the Khodka, if the spot market is going to compete with this 80-cent barrier we're talking about, right? So you're going to, it doesn't matter that West African costs 80 cents to come in, the Russians are going to just price their oil at a nickel below whatever the Saudi oil is.
Maybe.
The problem with the cost of getting it in the Hadka is the issue.
Yeah, right, that too, yeah, absolutely, yeah.
I mean,
Right.
the Russians will be solving another price discrimination problem, sending it one way or the other, right?
Right.
So we have to look at that.
Can I follow up on this? Talking to players in the market, what you hear is that the flow of Russian oil to Asia might be much larger in the future than we now anticipate. If you look at the European market, it's pretty well saturated. Apparently, there is this decree up from the majors to their refineries saying we're not going to invest in any upgrades of the refineries, which means that they will take quite a bit of sweet in Europe, which means there's no more room for Russian Urals. The same more or less in the US, although Exxon is taking quite a bit of Russian Urals. I was told that in general there's not such a huge appetite for Russian Urals in the US. So if you combine these two developments, where do the barrels go? East. This is at least one view, well, a couple of views out in the market. So I just want to throw that in to keep that in mind.
How will it get there? That's the interesting question.
Sure.
The transportation cost would seem
Yeah.
to make it uneconomical. It's just hard to imagine being able to ship, I mean, already shipping to Nabucco with Siberian crude that fits that market.
Yeah.
It's
But they can cut their
debatable
wholesale
whether you-
price, of course, right?
Well,
Well,
Why
compared
would
to
you?
$6 a barrel domestically, yeah.
See, exactly, and not selling it is the alternative.
Well, you know what? It's interesting you mention that, because there was this weird little news report that didn't make sense to me on an economics basis, but maybe it's what John's saying, is there's, I can't remember, I think it was Vitol, is taking Russian Urals at the Med and piping it through Israel,
That's right.
through into the Red
It's
Sea
to-
and bringing
to-
it back
to
around.
Elat, to Elat, and then they bring it.
Right, then they bring a tanker and bring it back around to Asia. So maybe we would see, ironically, you could have a reversal of Suez.
I just saw the other week, Russian Urals imports into China, I think it was for August, up to 450,000 barrels a day.
That's the array.
Oh, it was in tons. It was in tons, but it was dramatically up. Yeah,
Because there's no pipe.
yeah. So they're definitely pushing.
I had a question for Peter, back to the hydroelectric. Have you thought about the political risk aspect of that? I mean, have you thought about the political side in Russia? Do you see this as a feasible project?
That was the point of my comments about if Russia would, if the relationship between Russia and Japan were like the relationship between Canada and the United States. So you got big hydro capacity in the north, which you could ship south. Then this project would be much more of a goer. The point of that remark was that maybe the political factors are much more important in this.
I meant in the structure of the industries in Russia. I wasn't talking at the state level, but.
Oh, I mean, I think in relation to, would Japan like to have 50% of its electricity supplied by Russia?
No, I'm saying, would Russia decide to send?
Oh.
I mean, if we talk about, I mean, Amy was talking about the complexities of gas. When you enter the world of hydroelectric power, you're entering a political quagmire that makes the ones we're going to talk about in oil and gas simple in some ways. So have you thought about the likelihood that Russia would take this decision?
My understanding is that there are people within Russia who have broached this. There've been stories.
Yeah, we've had this Canadian company here that's, really dying to move this hydroelectric out. Can you, Martha, tell us for a minute or two what your perception is of the problems in that industry?
I mean, hydroelectric power is dominated by Urals, and they have really huge global plans, which I know more about the European plans than the Asian plans, but I can't believe that they don't want to sell in Asia as well. And their notion of going global is by stage. I mean, it fits in with some of the things I'm going to talk about in my session about the whole world of natural resources. But in the world of natural resources, the question of hydroelectric power is just coming up, and it's no less controversial than the question of gas. So if you're dealing with an unreformed gas sector, you're dealing with a partially reformed hydroelectric power, which is really designed to produce both strong fortunes and a lot of geopolitical kickback for the Russian state and the actors in the hydroelectric industry. It shouldn't be forgotten that the head of Urals is Chubais, who was prime minister and would like to be president and knows he is unlikely to be president, and so is looking for ways to become king of his world and not go to jail like Khodorkovsky. And he is somebody who is unlikely to ever go to jail. So it's such a hot potato. I mean, it's fascinating, but to get it there would really require many, I would argue, would really require several years before we'd even know how to ask the questions of how to make it feasible inside of Russia.
Is that potential being tapped at all within Russia? I mean, for supply within Russia?
Yes, it is definitely. I mean, it's a really, there's been a lot of movement paralleling the movement that Gazprom has had on unifying gas systems. There's been a lot of movement of unifying hydroelectric systems within the former Soviet Union. And Urals is in the process of trying to purchase, and will probably be able to purchase, hydroelectric plants, big plants that were never fully completed in Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan. And that would really allow them to supply a much broader market, including going into Europe. I don't know if it affects if this is an alternative to the sources we're talking about in Siberia. I mean, the problem is Russian hydroelectric is being split now, you know, into producers' grids and the agent at the end. And the relationship, Rauius's ability, there are more potential producers of hydroelectric power in Russia than there still are users. So the question of which power gets online first is very, very important. Anyway,
No,
it's a wonderful topic for a project for sure. Because as you point out, it flips back into the whole questions of gas, and it really, it's central to the questions of decontrolling Russia's natural monopolies.
Okay, let me ask you guys as a group, we're about 15 minutes behind, so should we take a 10-minute break? And then we'll come back for Martha's presentation.
Purposes of coherence, I think that's
Is the constraint, because the constraint is not the day, right? The constraint is we got a reservation for dinner at Fogo de Chao, which is one of the best, most fun restaurants in Houston now, but we really have to get there by 6, because it's a very crowded restaurant on Saturday nights, and they're holding a giant table for us. So we have to try to keep pace, because the bus is coming to get us at 5:30, and we need to try to stick with that. So anyway, this is Martha Alcott. She is one of the foremost authorities on, or actually probably the foremost authority on Central Asia and a authority on Russia. And she's going to talk to us a little bit about the sort of emerging politics inside Russia as it relates to the interaction between the government and the energy sector.
Okay, thank you. What I hope to contribute eventually to this project is a paper on what going global means for Russian companies. It draws on work that I've been doing for the last several years on changing management. I'm trying to think of how to put it. I did a lot of work in the first half of the 90s, political risk analysis in oil and gas and gold sectors in Russia and in Central Asia. And that made me really fascinated by the internal structure of these companies and how they understood the world and what their goals were vis-a-vis their own reorganization and going global and stuff. I'm a specialist on what was the national problem in the former Soviet Union, so I was really interested in control of assets and fights over assets. So I don't come from it from an energy industry point of view, but from a sort of political science and political economy point of view. This presentation is very much a work in progress, and I'm curious for people's reactions to it. 2 years ago, I published a piece called Reforming Russia's Tycoons and Foreign Policy that was the first part of this, you know, and so now what I've done is gone back to a lot of this material, and a lot of it was because of the conference that Amy and I organized in Moscow in June. Okay. What I want to try to do is get inside the heads of the people running the Russian firms and the people regulating the Russian firms to try to give you how the world looks from my reconstruction of that vantage point. And that world is very different from the vantage point of of what these people, how these people behave in front of us in multinational business settings. You know, it's like, it really, really is. We all play roles in our lives, and certainly these people play roles as well. 2003 represented an enormous step forward in the internationalization of the Russia's oil industry. I mean, that in the acquisition, the TNK BP acquisition was seen as heralding a new era. For, among other things, Western firms' exposure in Russia increased dramatically. And more importantly, I mean, it increased dramatically, and they acquired an asset that they didn't completely control. I would argue that a 50% ownership stake on foreign soil, I've been watching a lot of baseball, where you don't have home field advantage, is really not control. The ability to control a project, even with Russian management, is very, very difficult in a place like Russia. The sands are constantly slipping underneath you. As the industry was trying to absorb this and gossiping about whether this was a good or bad thing, there immediately began to be talk, almost immediately, about the new Yukosibneft, itself a giant oil monster, was seeking a strategic minority partner in either Exxon or Chevron, or there were rumors that they were. I want to talk some about both whether these deals are likely to go through, what impact they would have on the Russian oil industry, and try to give you a context, not take out a crystal ball and say Yukos is going to succeed in selling X percent to Y, but try to give you a sense of the context of decision making and where I see the Russian government today in encouraging some of these transactions and not allowing others. What are going to be the ground rules of these transactions? And I think I have some feel for that. And then talk some about pipelines to East and West and the way in which this fits in. And I really thank Amy for the opportunity to do this, because it has forced me to think about some things that I thought I understood in very new ways, especially about the interrelationship of East and West. Okay. I think the question of there's a question of whether the Russian oil industry can go global, and can it do this without selling large shares to Western majors. The answer to this question of whether and how fast the Russian oil industry can go global really depends upon how one defines global ambitions. And I want to talk for a minute or so about this, because I think this is really important. All the largest Russian oil companies have global ambitions, save possibly Surgutneft, which hasn't gotten there yet, which initially didn't, and has not yet begun to do much about what are likely to emerge as ambitions. But certainly TNK, we've seen, Yukos, Lukoil, we haven't talked, there has been very little talk about Lukoil, which has a different strategy for international engagement, mostly through strategic partnerships. Tatneft, which is Tartarstan's oil company, which does have small international ambitions, but does sell oil to Turkey and wants an international presence and is interested in downstream as well as upstream. And then two companies that I will come back to again, Rosneft and Zarubezhneft, which not only have global ambitions, are by definition international actors. They are both Russian state-owned firms, and they either hold licensing rights to projects that are being developed with Western firms, or they hold rights to foreign assets that used to be owned by the Soviet government, or both. But I would argue that the strategies of these firms are shaped very much by the time horizons of the players in the companies. And whether they are pursuing strategies, and all of this is a very long way to explain to you what I think is happening with Khodorkovsky. And when Amy and I chatted on the phone yesterday, I would not have predicted that he would be arrested today, but when I finished writing my talk, it doesn't come as a shock to me, So I think I can explain partly why he got arrested. Personal gain versus an evolution of society. As individuals, let me talk about the personal gain model. Part of the push for some people to go international, for some firms to go international, is for individuals who are eager to cash out, especially if the acquisition of their assets were done through insider trading or serious undervaluing of resources they got through the loan for shares deal. And anybody who doesn't know about that, that's really key to a lot of this, and I'm happy to talk about it in questions or later on. Which every oligarch swears lost him more money than he made, but which nobody believes that to be true. Okay, Simultaneously, so you have this personal gain argument, but simultaneously, Russians who are actively engaged in the economy believe that Russia's post-communist revolution will not be secured for another 10 to 15 years minimum. So they're really talking about a 25-year transition period. And they're talking about trying to position themselves, their children, their businesses, in this moving and evolving business environment. And because it's seen as taking another 10 to 15 years, people who are trying to get them there in 2 or 3 are really very, very threatening. And I'll talk more about that as we go along. So Western firms who are buying into the Russian oil industry today are securing assets whose values will be transformed as the playing field that they exist in is redefined. So the Russian playing field will be constantly redefined over the next 10 years, and Western investors may believe that their presence will redefine the playing field, but they can redefine that playing field only to the extent to which the greater Russian environment, which includes the Russian government and key Russian actors, will allow them to do it. So they can help redefine the field, but the Russians themselves really define the rules of the game. I mean, you can't move the Russians to, this is how I put it in my notes, that you can't move the Russians to redefine the rules of the game before they're ready to do it. So you can speed up the education process of convincing them that something's in their national interest or their personal interest, but you can't get them to act how they don't want to act. And I think anybody who thinks they can has really seen role-playing at its finest. A few words about the BP-TNK merger. TNK was largely pieced together with the intention of introducing Western-style management techniques and turning its assets as quickly as possible. The idea of TNK was to turn it around and sell it to a Westerner. That was the expectation within TNK and within Russia itself. The expectation in Russia is, as BP says, that it's going to take 10 years to homogenize the business styles. The expectation within Russia is that it will take several years for this firm to become a major actor in Russia. That's different from have productive assets, make lots of money. But they see, many Russians in the oil industry see the focus of this firm as merging upstream and downstream assets and plugging Russian oil into BP's global downstream, building on TNK's East European context, but not in redefining the way business is done in Russia. And I think that this is really critical, that their goals are understood as normal commercial goals. Okay. What about the Yukos merger, the possibilities of a Yukos merger, and the prospects of a Western firm really having a defining role in the Russian oil industry? And I want to spend some time on that. Putin and his friends have very complicated views on the ownership of Russia's natural resources, but they have very well-developed views on it. Putin himself did a dissertation, and whether he wrote it is not clear, but he certainly read it and agrees with it, and that's the important part, that his dissertation dealt with the role of strategic resources in Russia's economic developments, and it was written in 1998. This is not some communist-era piece of paper. And that's why I say it doesn't matter that whether he wrote it himself or not, he really does believe in these arguments. And in this dissertation, he argues he's very clearly against foreign ownership of Russia's assets. But he sees no way out of foreign direct investment and restricted foreign ownership of these assets. So he doesn't like it, but he sees it as inevitable to have some limited foreign ownership and continued foreign direct investment in order to raise enough capital to sustain the Russian state, to reform the Russian state, and more importantly, even to jumpstart economic development. Clearly, as we all know, the assets that were designated were those that were offshore and hard to work. And And there was very little, I mean, it's been hard for firms sometimes to do business and to get their deals through, but ideologically, they were not seen as the Russian heartland. They were not seen as giving up control of natural resources. For Putin, I would argue PSAs did not figure dramatically in the picture. They were really irrelevant. If they facilitated things, that was fine. If they were a political hot potato, he wasn't going to, throw himself on his sword and die for it. But there were other people around, vested political interests in the oil industry and outside of the oil industry, nationalist lobbies, groups in the Duma and stuff, to whom they were very critical. The PSAs were very disturbing to them, and that's one of the reasons he's had a fairly ambivalent policy towards them. Far more critical, and this I really think is part of the reasons why Khodorkovsky got to jail, was the whole question of the role of the state. The state under Putin is not going to leave the oil industry. The state under Putin is not going to give up control of natural monopolies. They are going to find ways to maintain a continuing control. That doesn't mean people can't buy assets, but the sort of decision-making of development, of prioritizing assets, and also of who's going to run the government, and I'll come to that in a second, is going to be set by the state. I mean, that, as long as Putin is in power, I really think we're going to see that situation. And not only that, I mean, Putin is up for election in 2004, and he's certainly going to win. And so now we're in the struggle for 2008. And there is going to be enormous pressure, mounting pressure. So pressure will be more after 2004 even than I think now, that whoever comes to power in 2008 will also hold this view, that these assets must be under state management. Because this is really where the power forces in Soviet society, they share this view, and we can talk about who are power forces, and it's not just people who were in the KGB. It's a very fluid and moving kind of group of people. Okay. As I say, so tremendously critical is the role of the state. Who defends this? Three companies, clearly, Rosneft, Zarubezhneft, and Tatneft, which is partly state-owned, owned by the government of Tatarstan, and lots of other people would be my guess. And Lukoil, which has a dual identity, is both private and partly state-owned. But it's much more cautious. It's for an expanding private sector. It's for commercialization of pipelines. But again, they are much more cautious than the other privately owned firms about how they're an inch behind the curve always. If Lukoil if Yukos has had a massive attack on the government or on Transneft, then Lukoil will do a fine presentation that makes similar points and couches them a bit more cautiously. So they're not the wave, but the behind the wave in a safe position. And most importantly, two transport companies that are not the oil industry, that are not oil producers, Gazprom and Transneft, who are both very much affected by the outcomes of decisions to deregulate the economy. Gazprom competes directly with the oil companies, and that's going to get more profound, not less profound, and if we have time at some point in the question period, I'm happy to talk about that. And Transneft, because what they do is move oil. I mean, it's clear why they're at odds. But I would argue that the competition between the big oil companies, the privately held ones in particular, and Gazprom is going to intensify and not get reduced. That this is really a major issue. It's an issue in Russia where they want to become producers and then they need different pipelines, and it's an enormous issue for people who have Caspian holdings because the balance of what's oil and what's gas is really going to become a political hot potato in a few years. Why target Khodorkovsky? Lots of good reasons. I'm not defending it, but lots of understandable reasons. People talk about his political ambitions, and no one but he knows what they really are, and maybe he himself was unsure about them. And I'm going to just take a minute to say this. It sounds smug, but I think it really explains a lot. If you go back to Russia and the incomplete nature of their revolution, and that's what I would argue, is that what we have is an incomplete revolution in Russia that started in 1988 or 89, Then you have the collapse of the Soviet Union, which speeded it up, but it's nowhere near complete. So given that Russia has an incomplete revolution, people who can buy US congressmen shouldn't buy too many Russian Duma members. And I'm not saying that they bought US congressmen, but I'm saying that those that have the money to lobby successfully for their cause in the West definitionally cause problems at home when they try to do the same thing. Because most people who are used to buying Duma members can't afford to buy US congressmen. So that you are stripping people who have lost an enormous amount of economic power of the last vestiges of their political power, which is speeding up a process of revolution. Okay. I can't believe that Khodorkovsky doesn't know what he was doing. You know, that very few billionaires in Russia were politically unconnected at the beginning of their lives. Khodorkovsky was one of the most connected of these people. How much do I have in time?
3 or 4 minutes.
Okay. He was the most connected. If I take 5, I can just about finish. Okay. He was he was the most connected of of this elite. And so he really understood the power structure because he used that to make his money initially. The Russian elite is very fragmented, and they really don't want to see 1 or 3 or even 5 billionaires consolidate political power, whether or not they do this democratically or not democratically. Part of being able to cash in one's assets is to do it in a way that doesn't get greedy. I mean, this notion of people cashing out is fine, selling out is fine, but you can't do it in a way that is translating economic power into denying other people political power. Okay. Can a big share of UCOS be sold in the West? I mean, there's been this interplay. I'll take just a minute on this so I have a minute on the pipelines. There's been this interplay as to whether he's serious about selling it and whether he can sell it and everything. I think that whatever Khodorkovsky's personal preference is, it's clear that this size assets cannot be safely sold without Kremlin's permission. And what conditions will the Kremlin allow? Again, I think that the Kremlin would be very nervous about any Western purchase that was going to redefine the framework of decision-making in the oil industry. That if a Western major came in with a 25% or 40% stake, and the idea was to change how Russia's oil industry was done, and to change the relationship of the pipelines to be a strong advocate with a lot of cash behind it for commercial pipelines, there would be a great deal of hesitation to it. Again, the transaction might be signed, but the turning that into a workable company would take longer than 2008. And I think when you get to 2010 and 2012, these things become less problematic. I mean, the expectation is that rewards have been given and power is being transformed. Okay, I'll skip all this. The last minute that I have, I want to talk about the global, other people are going to talk about geopolitics, but I want to just return to geopolitics to talk about this going global. Russia's oil companies going global has impact on geopolitics, quite obviously. And the Russian state, part of the control of natural resources, is to give the state a vehicle to use some of this. So they don't regulate the firms going global, but there is this interplay, one hand washes the other. This is very clear in Eastern Europe. This is very clear in the Caspian. And those are the 2 areas where Russian firms have the largest presence. I would argue that in terms of where the Russian oil and gas industry is today, I mean, what they are about today is serving Europe and using Caspian assets and East European assets wherever possible to increase Russia's presence in Europe. This is almost definitional, and this is not controversial. Pipelines, creating new pipelines to Europe do not require a redefinition of Russia's existing power structure, but creating new pipelines to Asia do. And this is one of the reasons why I think there's going to be no quick decisions on the sending oil either to Nakhodka or building a pipeline to Dakhing, because that's partly a geopolitical decision. It's also a decision of enormous impact on who develops the Russian Far East and who profits from the development of the Far East, who in the Far East profits from the development of the Far East. And these are decisions that the political environment is not yet ready to take. And until it is, then there can't be, and then all we'll see is like a continuation of the stalling process. To sort of conclude, I would say that Russian firms can go global. They will go global. But the firms that have that seek to turn themselves into Western-style firms that are advocates of Western transparency in their own country are really going to find very tough going in Russia until Russia's not ready for full transparency. Partial transparency is what Russian Democrats see as their goal at this point. And it will not be possible for the small group of billionaires to push the Russian political elite and economic elite faster in a direction than they want to go. Russia's a country of survivors. They've survived everything, from hundreds of years of the Tsar to the 12 years of transition. And these people are really going to mow down those that threaten their survival.
Okay, we have time for 2 questions from our Mr. Zhu, you can go first.
I was disappearing, sorry.
I would like to be a first people to ask a question because China experienced a lot in the recent years with dealing with Russia. Several projects, feel very hard to deal with Russian government and oil companies. One of them is we failed to buy slackness at the last minute because Abramovich can't to buy the company. And also, we are facing, big uncertainty of the pipeline down to Dakhing or Nakhodka. So, for the company like CNPC, China National Petroleum Company, really have to figure out what's the real strategy, or policy, or the right way to negotiate with Russian counterpart. So your topic is very interesting to me, find what's the Russian government strategy to the oil company or oil companies' behavior in globalization. So some, I have lots of questions, maybe I'll talk with you later, but some we can so far figure out what's the rule of the game in Russia, especially the corporate game, the rule. It's very tough. So did you have a comment about
Well, I guess
the behavior?
the question is, do you think that it is a priority for Russia to have some kind of exports going to China in the short term, or do you think that the Chinese are going to have to wait for all these things you've described to sort themselves out?
I think, and there are other people who will speak to this afternoon who may have different views and would probably know better, but I see Russia as not ready to figure out China. That they understand that long-term relations with China are going to be very complex to manage in anything resembling a dominant role for Russia. And again, I think they really understand Europe much better. And they understand that their image of their state, they have to contain China. Contain it is more aggressive than I mean, but they have to keep that from deteriorating as a relationship before they understand how to maximize it. But the way they will play out China will depend in part about how successful they are in making themselves more European, both in terms of developing long-term commercial relationships. But I think a lot of this really, in the end, still is gut power problems that haven't been worked out,
Right,
divisions
so,
of
so no
power.
private oil company is gonna choose to go to China if the Kremlin's not going to China. It can't be a decision of a private company.
It's also, if Transneft, it's also the decision to push out Transneft. It's not just that Yukos is trying to go to China for commercial reasons. The question is, should pipelines only be developed for commercial reasons? And the Russian government is not ready to say that's the case.
Yes.
And right now, Transneft, it isn't ready to make that decision yet, and it's not ready to reorganize. And if it's going to stay in business, it has to go through more reorganization than it has. It has to become, if it's going to continue to be a dominant natural monopoly, it has to become a more commercially viable dominant monopoly. And it then has to decide investing in what assets first will get them there. So it's like there's no constituency within Russia that counts in these questions that's ready to take this decision. There's no advantage to any of these people by taking this decision. There are lots of advantages by taking decisions in Europe, but there are no advantages, and there are a lot of disadvantages. So I don't think it's the pipeline that got, Khodorkovsky in deep trouble. Lukoil is just as out front on that. They're not in your face as much, but they're out front about it. But the question is how you push people to make decisions, and that's like for a different conference.
Regarding the relations between Russia and China, and I think the politically is good. The two countries keep a very good strategic partnership in going well so far, especially between the top leadership. But the question is for the business, for the pipeline, quite makes sense economically, but very hard to move ahead. So what's the reason behind? One of the answers is from your presentation, I think is make it clear, so far in the Far East or Eastern Siberia, we can find who is the best, receiver or the best partner to make the Eastern, economic development. Who will be best person to receive the profit from here, the government or the private company? I think it makes sense to me. And back to the question, my first question is, did you have any comment on the rule of the game of the Russian oil company? Because they behave quite different from the Western oil company.
I'm sorry,
He's saying is the rule of the game for Russian companies different from the Western companies, and how does that affect going to China?
That's the way they look at things, I think.
I mean, they look at things really differently than Western companies. I mean, how the ones that are making the transition to Western management styles are beginning to not. But I think that even by how they look at things, the move to China, what they're trying to do is position themselves to dominate in China. But I'm trying to think of a way to put it. That I would say that, and again, I could really be wrong, that I see the maneuvering to China as a way to break into some of these domestic fights. That the Chinese, from Yukos's point of view, it makes a lot more sense to have the Docking pipeline rather than the Khodka. That they just can make more money on their assets all the way along the way, and it's Western thinking, it's Russian thinking, it's anybody's thinking. It puts them at a strategic advantage. But I'm not sure that part of the posturing at this point in time is not to break the power of people, that have a different view of natural resources, that don't want them, that see them as national, and don't see them as being completely regulated by commercial relationships. And that I just can't. I don't have a good enough feel to know what dominates what. But both factors play a role.
Can I just, not to ask a question, but just to comment one more thing that hasn't been raised in the decision. I mean, I agree completely with the geopolitical context that people talked about, but also remember the Russians have just had a very bad experience with the single destination pipeline, the Blue Stream project to Turkey.
Yes.
And that's factoring into their thinking as they're looking at the Chinese option too.
And I was just at a conference in Honolulu, and there were several Russian analysts at that conference, and they all cited that as a reason. That's a big concern. And it's this concept of having a single buyer market, that buyer dictates the price, the buyer can decide not to take offtake, which is what's happened to them in Turkey, and that's a really serious concern.
Well, it's basically hamstrung by that single buyer.
Right.
I think the issue for going to Nahatka is it's a much further route. I mean,
Right,
it's
right, so you have
much more
the
expensive.
trade-off of the
Yeah.
two things.
And it would require a much higher volume, I believe.
Right,
Much bigger pipeline
absolutely.
to justify that.
I know there was a
All
question
right,
from
Dr.
the Far
Ivanoff,
East.
you get the last minute.
I just wanted to ask you whether the Carnegie Center in Moscow made some sort of research or discussion of the oligarchs' involvement in the legislature process, kind of Duma and that sort of things. I know that there are some press reports that Khodorkovsky was quite active in establishing special relationship with Yabloko, with Yatlinsky. And I would appreciate your opinion on, first of all, on the kind of the level of attention of the Carnegie Center to this phenomenon.
It's not,
And secondly, on the Khodorkovsky's real kind of involvement in what was happening in the Duma. For example, he was one of the most active critics of the PCA agreement. As we know, the PCA law was amended significantly in favor of views you represent.
yeah. There are several people who are looking at that at Carnegie. Lila Shevtsova has written a lot about it in recent times. And I'm not sure if Andrei Ryabov is working on it as well, because he studies the Duma. Certainly in my reading their writings, their arguments are that, well, first of all, some of them think it's a very good thing that he's doing this, but the arguments are that he was funding 3 different political groups and funding them in large amounts. And that was kind of what I was alluding to. It was why he was considered so threatening by people, that he was able to affect the political balance. And the expectation was that after the next election, and he was actively involved in this election, I mean, this was the old Duma, we don't know what the new Duma is going to look like. And that raises the question, which I think is a really serious question for all Russians, of what role should these individuals whose personal worth is that of a small state, what role should they have in their political process? And that's something that the Russians themselves are grappling with. If you did a poll in Moscow, is it a good thing or a bad thing that Khodorkovsky was arrested? I don't think he would want to have his release being based on getting 50% saying he should be out of jail. There's a real ambiguity about these people, and it's impossible. It's to be expected that there is. This is part of going through this revolution in a sense. This is part of Russia figuring out what its political process is going to look like.
In other words, from Mr. Putin's standpoint, potentially the problem is not only the control over the oil industry, but control over the politics.
And potentially, I mean, there are rumors that he wants to turn into a parliamentary republic. I mean, control of the Russian state. If Khodorkovsky had stayed in the oil industry, I think he could have come and had lunch with us today, It's that he chose to define his role as greater than what the rest of the political elite saw as that role. And it's not even clear whether his fellow oligarchs would see, the oligarchs of his generation, the Patanins. It would be interesting to know how Patanin views what Khodorkovsky is doing, whether he believes that Khodorkovsky overstepped, because there's somebody with ambitions just as large on a global scale, but who is really interested in maintaining his assets in Russia and having those assets become increasingly workable.
Okay, with that, I think it's time for lunch.